Jake Morrison walked through the crystal halls of the Galactic Academy, his footsteps echoing softly against the smooth walls. The building stretched high above him, with floating platforms and bridges connecting different sections. Students from dozens of worlds moved through the corridors, their alien forms creating a rainbow of colors and shapes. 3 months had passed since Jake arrived at this place. 3 months of sitting alone in classes, eating lunch by himself and watching other students whisper about him when they thought he could not hear. He understood why they acted this way. Humans had a reputation across the galaxy, and it was not a good one. The other students called his kind Deathworlders. They said humans came from a planet so dangerous that only the strongest and most violent creatures could survive there. They whispered stories about human wars, about something called berserker rage, and about Earth's deadly animals. Jake had heard these stories many times, but he never corrected them. Sometimes it was easier to let people believe what they wanted to believe. He turned a corner and saw his reflection in one of the Academy's mirrors. Jake looked ordinary enough: brown hair, average height, regular clothes. Nothing about him seemed threatening. But the other students saw something different when they looked at him. They saw a predator pretending to be peaceful. The morning sun shone through the Academy's transparent walls as Jake made his way to his favorite class. Professor Veltar taught advanced predator studies, and Jake found the subject fascinating. The professor was from Arcturus, with 4 arms and skin that changed colors based on his mood. Today his skin showed calm blue patterns, which meant the class would probably be peaceful. Jake entered the circular classroom and took his usual seat in the back row. The room was designed like an ancient amphitheater, with seats arranged in circles around a central area. Holographic displays floated in the air, ready to show images of the galaxy's most dangerous hunting species. Other students filed in slowly. Zixara, a crystalline being from Vega, chose a seat near the front. Her body looked like living glass, and she spoke through musical sounds that the universal translator turned into words. She always sat far from Jake, and her music became discordant. Whenever he was nearby, Groth entered next, his massive form moving carefully between the seats. He came from Tau Ceti, where his people lived as peaceful plant-eaters. His skin had a green tint, and small leaves grew from his shoulders and arms. Groth was kind to everyone, but Jake noticed how the alien's leaves would curl up tight when he came too close. Lyra slipped into the room like a shadow. She was from Proxima Centauri, with large dark eyes and pale skin. Her people could read thoughts, though she was polite enough to stay out of Jake's mind. She had told him once that human thoughts were too loud and chaotic for her to handle. Comfortably, more students arrived: a reptilian draconian, 2 floating energy beings from Rigel, and an insectoid creature whose name Jake could never pronounce correctly. They all found seats as far from Jake as possible, creating an invisible circle of empty space around him. Jake pulled out his notebook and pen, ignoring the stares and whispers. He had learned to write notes the old-fashioned way because his electronic devices made the other students nervous. They seemed to think that any human technology might be a weapon in disguise. Professor Veltar entered the room, his 4 arms carrying different teaching materials. His skin had shifted to a professional yellow-green color, and his large eyes scanned the classroom. When his gaze fell on Jake, the professor's skin flickered slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Good morning, students," Professor Veltar said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Today we will study the hunting patterns of apex predators from the Outer Rim territories. Please direct your attention to the central display." The holographic projector activated, showing a 3-dimensional image of a massive creature with 6 legs and razor-sharp teeth. The students leaned forward to get a better look, except for Jake, who sat back in his chair with his arms crossed. "This is a Zarian pack hunter," the professor continued. "They live on the volcanic world of Zarian Prime, where the surface temperature can reach 200 degrees Celsius. Notice their heat-resistant scales and their ability to work together as a coordinated unit." Jake watched the hologram with mild interest. The creature was impressive, but he had seen similar pack hunters in documentaries about earth wolves. The hunting patterns were almost identical: surround the prey, cut off escape routes and attack from multiple directions at once. The Zarian pack hunter is considered one of the most dangerous predators in known space, Professor Veltar explained. They have never been successfully kept in captivity, and their intelligence rivals that of most civilized species. Their only weakness is their need for extremely high temperatures. A student raised her hand. Professor, how do they compare to the predators from the human homeworld? The classroom fell silent. Jake felt every pair of eyes turned toward him, and he could sense the tension in the air. Professor Veltar's skin color shifted to a nervous orange. That is a complex question, the professor said carefully. Earth's predators are unique in many ways. They have adapted to survive in conditions that would kill most life forms. The diversity of hunting strategies on that world is remarkable. Jake continued taking notes, pretending not to notice the attention. He had heard variations of this conversation many times. The truth was that Earth's predators were not the strongest or fastest in the galaxy, but they were adaptable, and that made them dangerous in ways that other species found difficult to understand. The human homeworld, Professor Veltar continued, is classified as a Class 12 death world. Very few planets in the galaxy receive such a high danger rating. The fact that an intelligent species evolved there at all is considered remarkable. By xenobiologists. Zixara's crystalline form chimed softly. Professor, is it true that humans evolved from persistence hunters? Yes, the professor replied. Humans developed the ability to track prey over long distances, sometimes for days at a time. They would follow their target until it collapsed. From exhaustion, it is a very unusual hunting strategy. Jake smiled slightly. The professor was being diplomatic, but Jake knew what he was really thinking. Most predators in the galaxy killed quickly, with claws, teeth, or venom. The idea of slowly wearing down prey over days or weeks seemed cruel to species that had evolved different hunting methods. But surely, Groth said, his leaves rustling nervously, humans have evolved beyond such primitive behaviors? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jake looked up from his notebook and met Groth's eyes. The plant-based alien immediately looked away, his leaves curling tighter. Evolution is not about becoming less than what you were, Jake said quietly. It is about becoming more than what you need to be. The classroom was completely silent now. Jake's voice had been calm and measured, but something in his tone made the other students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Professor Veltar cleared his throat. Yes, well, that is an interesting perspective. Perhaps we should return to our study of the Zarian pack hunter. The holographic display changed, showing the creatures in action. They moved with deadly precision, their hunt choreographed like a dance. Jake watched the display and took notes, but part of his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the hunting strategies of Earth's predators, comparing them to what he saw on the screen. The other students gradually relaxed as the focus shifted away from humans and back to safer topics. But Jake noticed that they continued to glance at him throughout the class, as if they were trying to figure out some puzzle they could not solve. As the lesson continued, Jake found himself wondering what would happen if these students ever saw a real predator in action. Most of them had lived their entire lives in peaceful civilizations, where the deadliest creatures were kept safely behind barriers or studied from a distance. They knew predators only as academic subjects, not as living threats. The thought made him smile again, though he kept the expression hidden behind his notebook. Sometimes, Jake thought, the galaxy's fears about humans were not entirely wrong. They just did not understand the full picture. The holographic display showed another predator from the outer rim when the first alarm sounded. It was a soft beeping noise that made Professor Veltar pause mid-sentence. His forearms froze in place and his skin color shifted from yellow-green to a worried orange. That is unusual, the professor said, touching a control panel on his desk. The Academy security system rarely activates during class hours. Jake looked up from his notebook. The alarm did not sound particularly urgent, but something about it made the hair on his arms stand up. His instincts were telling him that danger was approaching, Though he could not yet identify what kind, the other students seemed less concerned. Zixara's crystalline form chimed softly in what Jake recognized as her species equivalent of a shrug. Groth's leaves rustled slightly, but he continued watching the holographic display with interest. Lyra closed her large eyes and seemed to be trying to read thoughts from somewhere else in the academy. A second alarm joined the first, this one louder and more insistent. Professor Veltar's skin turned a deeper shade of orange, and his forearms began moving nervously across his control panel. "Students, please remain calm," he said, though his voice carried a note of worry. "I am receiving an emergency communication." From Academy Security? The professor's eyes went unfocused as he accessed his neural implant. Jake watched his expression change from confusion to concern, then to something that looked like terror. The alien skin color drained to a pale white, and his forearms began trembling. "What is it, Professor?" Lyra asked, her telepathic abilities probably picking up waves of fear from the instructor's mind. Professor Veltar did not answer immediately. He was still connected to the security network, receiving information that made his condition worse by the second. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "There has been a breach in the Academy's defensive perimeter. Something has entered the building." "What kind of something?" Groth asked, his leaves now curling tightly against his body. The professor's skin color shifted again, this time to a deep purple that Jake had never seen before. It was the color of absolute terror. "A Catherian shadow stalker," Professor Veltar said. The classroom erupted in panic. Zixara's harmonic frequencies became a discordant scream of fear. Groth's leaves began falling from his body like snow, and the reptilian draconian student hissed in alarm. The two energy beings from Rigel flickered rapidly, their forms becoming unstable with anxiety. Jake had heard of shadow stalkers in his xenobiology classes, but he had never expected to encounter one. They were apex predators from the dark side of Kither Prime, where the sun never shone and the temperature stayed below freezing. They were 8 feet tall, bipedal, and covered in scales that could change color to match their surroundings. But their most terrifying ability was their near-perfect invisibility. Shadow stalkers could bend light around their bodies, making them almost impossible to see. They were patient hunters who enjoyed playing with their prey before making the kill. According to the textbooks, no one had ever survived a shadow stalker attack without weapons or military backup. "How's that possible?" Lyra asked, her voice shaking. "The Academy has the best security systems in the galaxy." "I do not know," Professor Veltar replied. "But the creature is somewhere in the building, and it appears to be moving toward this section." A third alarm joined the first two, and the classroom's lighting shifted to emergency mode. Red warning lights began flashing, and the holographic display shut down automatically. The transparent aluminum walls that normally provided a view of the Academy's gardens now showed blast shutters sliding into place. "Lockdown protocols are now active," an automated voice announced. "All students and faculty must remain in their current locations until the threat is neutralized." Jake felt his heart rate increase, but not from fear. Something else was happening inside him, something that made his senses sharper and his muscles tense. His body was preparing for combat, even though his mind had not yet made the decision to fight. The other students huddled together in the center of the classroom, as far from the walls as possible. Professor Veltar joined them, his 4 arms wrapped around his body in a protective gesture. They formed a tight circle, with the strongest students on the outside and the more vulnerable ones in the middle. Jake remained in his seat, separated from the group by several rows of empty chairs. No one invited him to join their defensive circle, and he did not try to approach them. Instead, he sat quietly and listened to the sounds coming from outside the classroom. The Academy's corridors were normally filled with the sounds of students and faculty moving between classes. Now there was only silence, broken occasionally by the distant hum of security systems and the soft whir of blast shutters sealing doorways. "Can you sense it?" Groth asked Lyra in a whisper. "Can you read its thoughts?" Lyra shook her head, her large eyes wide with fear. "I cannot touch its mind. It is too alien, too cold." There's nothing there but hunger and the desire to hunt. Jake noticed that the temperature in the classroom was dropping. It was subtle at first, just a few degrees, but it continued to decrease steadily. His breath began forming small clouds in the air, and he could see frost forming on the edges of the windows. "It is using thermal manipulation," Professor Veltar said, his voice barely audible. "Shadow stalkers can lower the temperature around them to slow their prey's movements." The group in the center of the classroom pressed closer together, trying to share body heat. Jake could see them shivering, their movements becoming sluggish, as the cold affected their metabolism. But the temperature change had a different effect on him. His body began producing more heat automatically, and his reflexes became faster rather than slower. A new sound entered the classroom, a soft scratching noise that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was rhythmic and deliberate, like claws being dragged across metal. The sound moved slowly around the room's perimeter, as if something was testing the barriers for weaknesses. "It is looking for a way in?" Zixara whispered, her crystalline form no longer chiming with music. Instead, she produced a low, mournful tone that made everyone even more nervous. The scratching stopped suddenly and the classroom fell completely silent. Even the emergency alarm seemed to pause, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Jake could hear his own heartbeat and the rapid breathing of the other students. Then the air in the room began to shimmer. It started near the main door, where the light seemed to bend and twist in impossible ways. The distortion was subtle, like heat waves rising from hot pavement, but it moved with purpose and intelligence. The Shadow Stalker had found a way through the Academy's defenses. "It is here," Professor Veltar said, his voice breaking with terror. The shimmer moved slowly into the room, and Jake could see the outline of something large and predatory. The creature was not completely invisible if he looked carefully. He could see the edges where light bent around its body. It was tall and lean, with long arms that ended in claws, and it moved with the fluid grace of a natural hunter. The Shadow Stalker paused just inside the doorway, its invisible head turning to scan the room. Jake felt its attention sweep over him like a cold wind, and he knew that the creature was evaluating the students, deciding which one would make the most interesting prey. The huddle of students in the center of the room became completely still, as if they hoped that remaining motionless would make them invisible. Professor Veltar's skin had turned so pale that he was almost transparent, and his forearms shook uncontrollably. The Shadow Stalker began moving again, circling the room with deliberate slowness. It was in no hurry to make its choice. This was part of the hunt, the psychological torture that came before the physical attack. The creature fed on fear as much as flesh, and it was savoring the terror radiating from its potential victims. Jake watched the invisible predator's movements with growing interest. Its hunting pattern was similar to what he had seen in Earth's big cats: the slow stalk, the careful positioning, the patient wait for the perfect moment to strike. But there was something else in its behavior, something that reminded him of a different kind of predator. The Shadow Stalker was playing with its food. As the creature completed its first circuit of the room, Jake felt something change inside himself. The fear that had been building in his chest transformed into something else entirely. His muscles relaxed, his breathing slowed, and a small smile appeared on his face. For the first time since arriving at the Academy, Jake Morrison felt completely at home. The Shadow Stalker completed its second circle around the room, and Jake could see it was getting closer to making its choice. The creature's invisible form paused near the group of huddled students, and Jake heard a sound that made his skin crawl. A low, rumbling purr that sounded almost like pleasure. The alien predator was enjoying this moment. It was savoring the fear that filled the room like a fine wine. Jake watched as the shimmer in the air moved closer to Professor Veltar, who had begun making small whimpering sounds. That was when Jake stood up. The movement was smooth and deliberate, and it caught everyone's attention immediately. The other students stared at him with expressions of horror and disbelief. Even the Shadow Stalker's invisible form turned toward him, as if surprised that one of its prey had dared to move. "Jake, what are you doing?" Lyra whispered, Her telepathic abilities probably picking up emotions from his mind that she did not understand. Jake did not answer immediately. He was busy studying the creature's position, noting how it moved, analyzing its hunting pattern. The Shadow Stalker was impressive, but it was not the most dangerous predator Jake had ever encountered. That honor belonged to something much closer to home. "Sit down," Professor Veltar hissed. "Do not attract its attention." But Jake was already walking down the steps of the amphitheater, moving away from his back row seat and toward the center of the room. His movements were fluid and quiet, each step placed carefully to avoid making noise. The other students watched him with growing horror as he approached the area where the Shadow Stalker waited. "He has lost his mind," Zixara chimed softly, her crystalline form flickering with anxiety. "The fear has driven him insane." Jake smiled at that comment. Fear was not what was driving him. Something else entirely was taking control of his actions. Something that the other students could not understand. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Jake felt completely natural. He felt like himself. The Shadow Stalker's invisible form shifted, and Jake could sense its confusion. The creature was used to prey that cowered and trembled, not prey that approached willingly. Its hunting instincts were telling it that something was wrong, but it could not identify what. Jake stopped walking when he reached the center of the room, just a few feet away from where the creature waited. He stood there calmly, his hands at his sides, his breathing slow and steady. The temperature around him was still dropping, but he seemed unaffected by the cold. "I can see you," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. The Shadow Stalker's form became completely still. For a moment, nothing moved except the gentle rise and fall of Jake's chest as he breathed. Then the creature began to circle him, its invisible claws clicking softly against the floor. "Your camouflage is good," Jake continued, his head turning to track the creature's movement, "but not perfect. I can see the way light bends around your body. I can hear your footsteps. I can smell your scent." Professor Veltar made a choking sound. "What is he doing?" the alien whispered. "He is talking to it," Groth replied, his leaves rustling with nervousness. "But why?" Jake heard their whispered conversation, but he did not take his attention away from the predator. The Shadow Stalker had stopped circling and was now standing directly in front of him. Jake could see the outline of its head tilted slightly as if it was studying him. "You are confused," Jake said, addressing the creature directly. "You expected fear, but you are not getting it. You expected prey, but you found something else." The Shadow Stalker made a sound that was part growl, part hiss. It was a warning, the kind of noise predators made when they felt threatened. But Jake did not back away. Instead, he took a step closer. "I know what you are," Jake said, his voice taking on a different quality. It was still calm, but there was something underneath it now, something that made the other students shift uncomfortably. "You are an apex predator from a world where the sun never shines. You hunt for sport, not just survival. You enjoy the chase as much as the kill." The creature's invisible form leaned forward, and Jake could feel its breath on his face. It was cold and smelled like metal and ice. Any normal person would have been paralyzed with terror, but Jake's expression remained unchanged. "But I know something else about you," Jake continued. "You have never been hunted. You have never been prey. You have never felt the fear that you cause in others." The Shadow Stalker made another sound, this one more uncertain. Jake could see its form shifting, and he knew that the creature was becoming agitated. It was used to controlling every aspect of the hunt, but this conversation was not going according to its expectations. "Let me show you something," Jake said, and his voice changed again. The calmness was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Anticipation, excitement, and something that sounded almost like joy. Jake began to move, but not away from the creature. Instead, he started walking around it, his movements smooth and predatory. The Shadow Stalker turned to follow him, but Jake was already changing direction, forcing the creature to constantly adjust its position. "This is how we hunt on my world," Jake said as he moved. "We do not rely on camouflage or claws or venom. We use persistence, we use intelligence. We use the one thing that makes us more dangerous than any other predator in the galaxy. What is that? Professor Veltar asked, his voice barely audible. Jake stopped moving and looked directly at the spot where the Shadowstalker's eyes would be. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried a weight that made everyone in the room hold their breath. We learn. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Jake began moving again, but this time his pattern was different. He was no longer just walking around the creature. He was studying it, analyzing its reactions, learning its behavioral patterns. You move your right foot first when you turn, Jake said, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher giving a lecture. You favor your left side when you attack. You make a clicking sound with your claws when you are nervous. You breathe faster when you are confused. The Shadowstalker's form became more agitated with each observation. It was not used to being analyzed, catalogued, and understood. It was the one who studied prey, not the other way around. You are approximately 8 feet tall and weigh around 300 pounds, Jake continued. Your reach is longer than mine, but your reflexes are slower. You are built for power, not speed. You rely on fear to disable your prey before you attack. The creature made a sound that was pure frustration. It lunged forward, its invisible claws extending toward Jake's chest. But Jake was already moving, stepping aside with fluid grace. The creature's claws passed harmlessly through the air where he had been standing. Too slow, Jake said, his voice now carrying a note of amusement. And too predictable. The other students watched in stunned silence as Jake continued to move around the increasingly frustrated predator. He was not just avoiding its attacks, he was making them look clumsy and ineffective. Every time the Shadowstalker tried to use its superior reach or strength, Jake found a way to turn the creature's advantages against it. This is impossible, Zixara whispered, her crystalline form chiming with disbelief. He is just a human. How can he do this? Because he is not just a human, Lyra said, her telepathic abilities finally making sense of what she was seeing. He is something else entirely. Jake heard their conversation, and his smile widened. He was beginning to enjoy himself, and that enjoyment was visible in every movement he made. The quiet, reserved student who had sat in the back of the classroom was gone, replaced by something that the other students were only now beginning to understand. Would you like to know the most dangerous thing about humans? Jake asked, addressing both the creature and his classmates. We do not just hunt to survive. We hunt because we evolved to hunt. It is what we are designed to do. The Shadowstalker made another lunge, this one more desperate than the last. Jake stepped aside again, but this time he reached out and touched the creature's invisible arm as it passed. The contact was brief, but it sent a clear message. Jake could have hurt the predator if he had chosen to. The creature stumbled and turned, its form now visibly shaking with rage and something else, something that looked very much like fear. Now, you are beginning to understand, Jake said, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made everyone in the room shiver. Now you know what it feels like to be prey. The Shadowstalker backed away from Jake, its invisible form trembling with a mixture of rage and confusion. For the first time in its existence, the apex predator was experiencing something it had never felt before: uncertainty. Its prey was not acting like prey at all. Jake watched the creature retreat and felt a surge of satisfaction. The psychological battle was already won. Now came the interesting part, the physical confrontation. Jake had been analyzing the creature's movements for several minutes, and he had identified its weaknesses. You rely too much on fear, Jake said, his voice calm and educational. When fear does not work, you have no backup strategy. That is your first mistake. The Shadowstalker made a sound that was part roar, part scream. It was the sound of a predator that had never been challenged before, and it did not know how to handle the experience. The creature lunged again, but this time, Jake was ready for it. Instead of simply stepping aside, Jake moved toward the creature. He ducked under its invisible claws and rolled across the floor, coming up behind the Shadowstalker in a smooth motion. The creature spun around, but Jake was already moving again, using the classroom's furniture as cover. Your second mistake, Jake said as he vaulted over a desk, is assuming that all prey thinks the same way. You have spent your entire life hunting creatures that run from danger, but humans are different, we run toward it. The other students watched in amazement as Jake began using the classroom itself as a weapon. He knocked over chairs to create obstacles, used the holographic projectors to cast confusing shadows, and manipulated the lighting controls to create areas of brightness and darkness that favored his movements over the creatures. Professor Veltares' forearms were shaking as he watched the impossible scene unfold. "How is he doing this?" the alien whispered. "The Shadowstalker is supposed to be undefeatable." "Maybe it is," Groth said, his leaves rustling with nervous energy. "But Jake is not trying to defeat it, he is trying to teach it." The plant-based alien was right? Jake was not fighting to kill the creature, he was fighting to educate it. Every move he made was calculated to demonstrate a point about human hunting strategies. He was giving his classmates a practical lesson that no textbook could provide. The Shadowstalker tried to use its camouflage advantage by becoming completely invisible, but Jake had already anticipated this move. He pulled out a small device from his pocket, a simple laser pointer that he used during presentations. The red beam cut through the air, and where it touched the creature's invisible form, it created a brief outline. "Thermal camouflage has limitations," Jake explained as he moved the laser beam across the creature's body. "It can bend visible light, but it cannot completely eliminate heat signatures or physical displacement. You are invisible, but you are not incorporeal." The Shadowstalker realized that its primary advantage had been neutralized. It made a desperate charge across the room, its claws extended and its invisible mouth open in a silent roar. But Jake was no longer where the creature expected him to be. He had climbed onto one of the upper platforms of the amphitheater, using the classroom's architecture to gain a height advantage. When the Shadowstalker reached the spot where Jake had been standing, it found nothing but empty air. "Your third mistake," Jake called down from above, "is linear thinking. You assume that prey will stay on the ground because that is where you prefer to hunt. But humans are climbers. We use three-dimensional space." The creature looked up, its invisible head tracking Jake's position. For a moment, they stared at each other across the vertical distance of the classroom. Jake could see the outline of the creature's eyes, and what he saw there made him smile. The Shadowstalker was afraid that it was not the paralyzing terror that the creature usually inspired in its prey. It was something deeper and more fundamental, the fear of a predator that had suddenly realized it was no longer at the top of the food chain. Jake jumped down from the platform, landing silently on the floor behind the creature. The Shadowstalker spun around, but Jake was already moving, staying just outside the range of its claws. He was no longer trying to avoid the creature, he was hurting it, controlling its movements and forcing it to go where he wanted it to go. "This is how humans hunt," Jake said as he guided the increasingly frantic creature around the room. "We do not overpower our prey. We outsmart it. We make it exhaust itself. We turn its own instincts against it." The Shadowstalker was becoming more desperate with each failed attack. Its movements were no longer smooth and controlled. They were wild and unpredictable. But unpredictable was exactly what Jake had been waiting for. Desperate creatures made mistakes, and mistakes created opportunities. The creature made one final, massive lunge toward Jake, putting all of its strength and speed into the attack. But instead of dodging, Jake did something that shocked everyone in the room. He stepped forward to meet the charge. Time seemed to slow as the two predators collided. Jake twisted his body at the last second, using the creature's own momentum against it. His hands found purchase on the Shadowstalker's invisible arms, and he used leverage and physics to redirect the creature's charge into the classroom wall. The impact was tremendous. The Shadowstalker hit the transparent aluminum barrier with enough force to crack the material. For a moment, its camouflage failed completely, and everyone could see the creature in its full, terrifying glory. It was exactly as the textbooks described: 8 feet tall, covered in dark scales, with claws like knives and eyes like black holes. But now those eyes showed something that no textbook had ever mentioned: fear and respect for a superior predator. The creature slumped against the wall, not seriously injured but clearly defeated. Its camouflage flickered back into partial operation, but it made no attempt to attack again. Instead, it watched Jake with the wary attention of a beaten animal. Jake stood in the center of the room, not even breathing hard from the confrontation. His clothes were slightly disheveled, but otherwise he looked exactly the same as he had at the beginning of class. The only difference was in his eyes. They held a satisfaction that made the other students shrink back in their seats. "The final lesson," Jake said, addressing both the creature and his classmates, "is that the most dangerous predator is not the one with the biggest claws or the best camouflage. It is the one that can adapt faster than its prey can evolve." The Shadowstalker made a sound that was almost like a whimper. It was the sound of acknowledgement, of a predator recognizing another predator as its superior. The creature began moving toward the classroom door, its movements slow and deliberate. "Where is it going?" Zixara asked, her crystalline form chiming with confusion. "It is leaving," Jake said simply. "The hunt is over." But before the creature reached the door, it stopped and turned back toward Jake. For a long moment, the two predators looked at each other across the distance of the classroom. Then the Shadowstalker did something that no one expected. It lowered its invisible head in what could only be described as a bow. It was a gesture of respect from one apex predator to another. Jake nodded in return, accepting the acknowledgement. Then the Shadowstalker continued to the door and disappeared into the corridor, its form fading completely from view. The sound of its footsteps grew fainter and fainter until they could no longer be heard. The classroom was completely silent. Emergency alarms were still flashing, but they seemed distant and unimportant. Everyone was staring at Jake, who had calmly walked back to his seat and picked up his notebook as if nothing unusual had happened. "Class dismissed," Professor Veltar said weakly, his forearms hanging limply at his sides. His skin had turned, a color that Jake had never seen before, a pale green that seemed to indicate complete shock, but none of the students moved. They remained frozen in their seats, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The quiet human student who had sat alone in the back of the classroom had just defeated one of the galaxy's most feared predators without breaking a sweat. Jake looked up from his notebook and saw them all staring at him. "Is there something wrong?" he asked, his voice returning to its normal, calm tone. "Who are you?" Lyra whispered, her telepathic abilities finally able to touch the edges of Jake's mind. What she found there made her recoil in terror. His thoughts were not chaotic at all. They were organized, controlled, and utterly predatory. Jake smiled, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, it was a completely genuine expression. "I am exactly what you thought I was," he said. "I am a human." The emergency alarms finally stopped, leaving the classroom in complete silence. Jake sat in his usual seat, writing notes in his notebook as if the last hour had been an ordinary lecture. The other students remained frozen in their positions, staring at him with expressions that mixed fear, amazement, and confusion. Professor Veltar was the first to break the silence. His forearm shook as he activated his communication device to contact Academy security. "This is Professor Veltar in Classroom 7, he said, his voice barely steady. "The threat has been ... neutralized. The creature has left the building. We need a medical team to check the students for shock." "Understood, Professor," came the reply. "Security teams are tracking the creature's exit path. It appears to be leaving Academy grounds entirely." "How was it neutralized? Did our security forces engage it?" Professor Veltar looked at Jake, who continued writing in his notebook without looking up. "No," the professor said slowly. "It was handled by ... a student." There was a long pause from the other end of the communication. "Did you say a student, Professor? Yes, I will file a full report later. For now, please send counselors to help the other students process what they witnessed." Professor Veltar ended the communication and walked slowly toward Jake. His skin color had stabilized at a nervous yellow, and his large eyes studied the human with newfound respect and wariness. "Jake," the professor said carefully, "I think we need to talk." Jake looked up from his notebook, his expression mild and pleasant. Of course, Professor. What would you like to discuss? What just happened here was not normal student behavior. You displayed capabilities that are extraordinary. Jake shrugged. I just used basic human survival instincts, nothing special. Groths. Leaves rustled loudly. Nothing special? The plant-based alien said, his voice higher than usual. You defeated a shadow stalker with your bare hands. That is impossible. I did not defeat it, Jake corrected gently. I educated it. There is a difference. Zixara's crystalline form chimed with a discordant note. You made it bow to you? I have never heard of any creature showing respect to a shadow stalker, let alone the other way around. Jake closed his notebook and stood up, his movements calm and non-threatening. But now the other students tensed when he moved, as if they were seeing him for the first time. May I ask you all a question? Jake said, looking around the room. What do you think makes a predator dangerous? Lyra answered first, her telepathic abilities still reeling from what she had sensed in Jake's mind. Strength, speed, natural. Weapons like claws and teeth? Good answer, Jake said, nodding. Those are certainly important. What else? Camouflage, Professor Veltar added. The ability to hunt without being detected? Also good. Anything else? The room was quiet for a moment. Then Groth spoke up, his leaves curling nervously. Intelligence? Jake smiled, and this time his expression made everyone except Professor Veltar step back slightly. Excellent. Intelligence is indeed important, but you are missing the most crucial element. What is that? Professor Veltar asked. Adaptability, Jake said simply. The ability to change your hunting strategy based on your prey, your environment, and your circumstances. That is what makes humans dangerous, not our strength or speed. Jake began walking around the room, his movements casual but somehow predatory. The other students tracked his progress with their eyes, like prey animals watching a hunter. The shadow stalker is an apex predator on its homeworld, Jake continued. It has evolved perfect camouflage, deadly claws, and supernatural patience. But it has one critical weakness: it is never needed to adapt. On Killer Prime, it is the ultimate hunter. Nothing challenges it, so it never learned to change its tactics. But you did, Professor Veltar said, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. Humans evolved on a world where adaptation was required for survival, Jake explained. We competed with saber-toothed cats, giant bears, poisonous snakes, and dozens of other apex predators. We could not outmuscle them, so we had to outthink them. Jake stopped walking and faced the group directly. We learned to use tools. We learned to work together. We learned to think several moves ahead of our prey. Most importantly, we learned to learn from every encounter. That is why you were not afraid, Lyra said, her telepathic abilities finally making sense of what she had witnessed. You saw the shadow stalker as a learning opportunity. Exactly, Jake said. Fear is useful when it keeps you alive, but it becomes a weakness when it prevents you from thinking clearly. The shadow stalker relied on fear to disable its prey. When that did not work on me, it had no backup plan. Groth's leaves were starting to uncurl slightly. So you studied it while it was trying to hunt you. I studied it before it tried to hunt me, Jake corrected. I have been reading about shadow stalkers since my first week at the academy. I knew their hunting patterns, their physical capabilities, and their psychological tactics. When one actually appeared, I simply applied that knowledge. Professor Veltar's skin color shifted to a thoughtful blue. You prepared for this possibility? I prepare for many possibilities, Jake said matter-of-factly. That is what humans do. We plan for threats that may never materialize, just in case they do. The professor activated his holographic display, showing an image of Jake's academic record. Your grades in predator studies are among the highest in the class, but you never participate in discussions. Why? Jake was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Because when I share my thoughts about hunting strategies, the other students become uncomfortable. They prefer to think of predators as distant academic subjects, not as practical problems that might need solving. But today was different, Zixara observed, her crystalline form chiming more melodiously now. Today you had to act. Today I had an opportunity to demonstrate that humans are not the monsters you think we are. Jake. Sod, we are predators, yes, but we are also protectors. We hunt to survive, but we also hunt to defend others. The room fell silent again as the students processed this statement. Jake had not just defeated the Shadowstalker, he had done it to protect them. His classmates who had feared and avoided him for months were the very people he had risked his life to save. Why? Groth asked, his voice soft. Why protect us when we have treated you badly? Jake's expression became gentle, almost sad. Because that is also what humans do. We protect our pack, even when our pack does not fully accept us. Professor Veltar's communication device activated again. Professor, this is Academy Director Chun. I need to speak with the student who handled the Shadowstalker incident. Can you bring him to my office? Of course, Director, Professor Veltar replied. He looked at Jake. Are you ready to explain this to the administration? Jake picked up his notebook and headed toward the door. I am ready to explain it to anyone who wants to understand. As he reached the doorway, Lyra called out to him. Jake, wait. He turned back to face her. What you did today, ... will you teach us? Will you show us how to think like you do? Jake considered the question seriously. Do you really want to learn? Because understanding human tactics means understanding human nature. It means accepting that we are predators who choose to be civilized, not civilized beings who have overcome our predatory instincts. The students looked at each other, then back at Jake. One by one, they nodded. Then yes, Jake said, smiling genuinely for the second time that day. I will teach you. But not here and not in a traditional classroom. Where then? Professor Veltar asked. In the Academy's survival training facility. If you want to understand predators, you need to experience what it feels like to be both hunter and prey. Jake left the classroom, heading toward his meeting with the Academy administration. Behind him, his classmates sat in thoughtful silence, finally beginning to understand that the human they had feared was exactly the kind of ally they needed in a dangerous galaxy. 3 days later, Jake Morrison was appointed as the Academy's first student instructor of survival psychology. His course, officially titled Adaptive Tactics and Predator Psychology, had a waiting list of over 200 students from across the galaxy. The quiet human, who had sat alone in the back of the classroom, had become the Academy's most popular teacher, proving that the deadliest predator was indeed the one that could adapt to any situation, including the situation of turning enemies into students and fear into respect.